Guys, welcome to this EGADS art workshop where we're going to learn about animation. My name's Summer. I'm the EGADS art workshop junior officer this year, and I'm taking over this art workshop. If you could, please sign in with this QR code. This helps us track our audience and any criticisms or feedback you might have on the workshop so we can continue to keep these workshops engaging for y'all. Before we get started, what are art workshops? For those that are new here, art workshops provide intro-friendly courses to creating art for video games, software tutorials for beginners, we're doing 2D in the fall and 3D in the spring, a space for one-on-one help with artistic growth, and a community of artists for support in your journey. Go ahead and follow the Art Workshops Discord channel in the EGADS Discord if you haven't already, so that you can keep up to date on any new releases we have about art workshops. So we'll put these slideshows there and any videos we have there for your future reference. So now for an overview. Animation is the process of taking still images and manipulating them to emulate motion. For a very brief history lesson on animation, one of the first and very historic animations comes from The Horse in Motion by Edward Muybridge. In 1878, Muybridge took 6 images of a horse in motion, and when projecting them right after another in rapid succession, an animation of a horse gallop was made. Not only did it prove that horses do run with 4 limbs suspended off the floor in a single moment, this simple animation is also widely considered the first motion picture, creating the idea and concept of taking photographs and sequencing them in order to create an illusion of motion. So one day, animators had this crazy idea. We take a clay model and take a picture of it, then we slightly move the pose and take another picture of it, then we move it even more slightly and take another picture of it. We keep on doing that and we find ourselves making stop motion animation. One interesting thing about stop motion is that everything had to be sculpted. I'm sure you've seen stop motion animations before, but maybe you haven't thought about how every single frame had to be painstakingly positioned and photographed for the animation to be created. So these would take forever, obviously. There would be so many props and even facial expressions on removable heads. So eventually there was the advent of 2D cell animation. So I'm sure you've seen cell animation before. Originally, in the Disney cell animation era, animators drew everything on transparent sheets called cells and would overlay it on a pre-drawn background. They could make an animation by trading out a cell every single frame, taking a picture, and by that translating it to film. Fast forward, we got the invention of the computer, and now we've got 2D and 3D animation that is computer generated and animated. So the physical cells are instead now digitized, and programs have eased the workload of the traditional animation process. Now we're going to talk about the 12 principles of animation. So the phrase 12 principles of animation was coined by Disney animators Ollie Johnston and Frank Thomas. You can find the discussion of these 12 principles of animation in their Disney Animators Guidebook, The Illusion of Life, Disney Animation. This book is still really prevalent and used to this day, and the 12 principles of animation are considered the foundational principles of making a good animation. So we're going to talk about them today. They make sure that animation follows real-world physics and is coherent in its action. So the first principle is squash and stretch. An object will squash or stretch based on its speed and weight. Extreme stretching and squashing emulates a soft object, while less stretching and squashing will emulate a hard object. Objects must stay consistent in volume while being squashed or stretched. So one of the key things with that is that the object that you're drawing, it must stay consistent in volume. So what you're thinking with that is that if it suddenly becomes extremely smaller or larger when you're squashing and stretching it, it will go off model or look like a different character or a different object of a different size, and then it kind of breaks that illusion that squash and stretch was making of the exaggeration of the motion. So you have to be very careful that you aren't making it too large or too small as you do this. Anticipation. Anticipation is the pre-action that communicates the next action. It helps the character communicate by preparing them for their action. If the character were to jump, they would have to bend their knees before jumping off the floor. A punch would have the arm wind up behind them before the arm suddenly flings out in a punch motion. The anticipation action is needed to bring clarity on what the character is going to do. Without that bending of the knees, the viewer will be confused on where the energy of the jump comes from. An action without anticipation will be weaker, which can also be weaponized to actually show the amount of power of movement. Anticipation is used to draw attention. Having a character look at an object will have the viewers anticipate that the object will be interacted with, but it would also be surprising if the next action happened not where you're currently looking or engaging. So take a look at these examples we have on this slide. You can see that the movement without anticipation seems to come out of nowhere. The movement with anticipation feels more natural, and you can see where it's coming from. That idea of potential and kinetic energy, you need to show where that energy for the motion is coming from in order it to feel realistic. Now, staging. So staging is the presentation of any idea that makes things unmistakably clear to understand. This concept leads more to the composition of a shot, such as the utilization of timing and positioning of camera and people. The whole idea is to make sure the audience is looking exactly where you want them to look. Make sure each main action isn't being upstaged by another competing action, and make sure an action finishes before the next action takes place. Without proper staging, the viewer doesn't know where to look and is lost with what's happening. This concept is borrowed more on the film side of the industry, so think about a cut scene and how you can make a boss look super intimidating by having the camera pointing underneath them to emphasize their size. Maybe the camera shakes when they roar, and then you're able to tell what's happening in that scene. In general, people's eyes are drawn to movement. Stage your level designs so it's unmistakably clear what the target goal is. If there are only select animated elements in a stage, people will naturally be drawn to check them out. So basically, this idea of staging in animation is widely used in the idea of level design too. So if you're doing level design for games, you want to think about how you're staging that level to make the player move through it so that their eyes are drawn to the important parts of that level. Straight ahead versus pose to pose. There are two approaches when it comes to animating. Straight ahead is where you draw a frame and then the next right after, which might be the first way that you would think of making an animation. But also there's pose to pose, where you draw the key or important poses of each action and draw a frame in between each. Pose to pose is best in most cases since you have a solid foundation and idea on where and how an animation will progress and end. Drawing straight ahead can lead to morphing and any posing mistakes where you might have to redraw multiple frames instead of catching them early on. However, straight ahead is best for movement that is organic and procedural, such as fire or hair, where you might have a hard time finding or guessing at key poses. You can ultimately combine these two approaches as you draw the main action with pose to pose and the overlapping action from any appendages with straight ahead. So for example, this guy at the bottom left walking, you can see on the bottom is a pose to pose animation. But if you wanted to add hair, you might straight ahead the hair on top of that pose to pose animation because the hair is a natural movement where it'd be difficult to predict the bouncing of it as he walks. Follow through and overlapping action. This concept is mainly for the appendages that are attached to the main body. Follow-through is the concept that when the appendage follows through with motion after a main body has stopped, and overlapping action is the idea that each appendage will move at a different rate than the main body, and there's a concept of drag where appendages need to catch up to the main body. Ultimately, the tip of the appendage that is last to leave its position will follow through with the overshoot last as the movement needs to catch up with the main body. The amount of drag an object has, how fast an appendage takes to return to its starting position, can emulate or represent the mass of an appendage. Less drag is heavier, and more drag is lighter. This concept also applies to humans. Hands must follow through behind the elbow as it follows through behind the shoulder, and when a body comes to a sudden stop, limbs may flail forward before overshooting and then coming to rest. So think about when you walk, how there's an arm just dragging behind you. If you were animating that person walking, you would want to think about that arm appendage as separate from the main body, just attached at the shoulder, and then dragging behind based on the weight. So this cat in the bottom right, you can see that its tail, when you're thinking about follow through, it feels more natural because that tail is being pulled by and dragged behind the main cat body. Slow in and slow out. In nature, things need time to accelerate and to slow down. With slow in and slow out, adding more frames to build acceleration and deceleration makes things look more lifelike and less robotic. Take your key poses, draw the middle pose, draw the in-between of those poses, and then only draw an in-between that is skewed towards the key poses. Instead of an object moving at a constant rate, we will now have natural acceleration and deceleration. Note that not everything needs a slow in or slow out. An abrupt stop is actually sold through the lack of slowdown, while an abrupt speed up creates unknown energy. So take a look at this car in the bottom left. It might look like the amount of frames in the motion is different, but it's actually the same amount of frames, they're just positioned differently. The car at the top looks more like it accelerates like a real car, while the car at the bottom seems to unnaturally just drift forward. That's because the car at the bottom, all those keyframes are evenly spaced out. The car at the top has an acceleration and deceleration that might better represent a real life car. Arcs. This is a super important animation concept. In nature, objects don't move in a straight line. They tend to follow an arced trajectory. It might seem natural that a ball would bounce in an arc, but its gravity and air drag. Oh, it might seem unnatural that a ball would bounce in an arc. Yes, but its gravity and air drag slows it into an arc, or else it would just go in a straight line up and down when it hits something. Arcs are something that objects and humans follow due to real-world physics, and animating arcs will make animations more realistic. Human joints are a bunch of ball joints, so it's incredibly hard to perfectly move in straight lines. So take a look at this rotoscoped animation on the left. You can see that as he throws the disc, that arm, it recoils in an arc shape animation. So this is something that might be really fun to look for in your favorite games or your favorite cutscenes or your favorite amazing fight animations. You will see so many arcs in every motion because it just feels more natural and realistic that way. If instead you had every limb moving in a straight line, it wouldn't feel realistic or like actual life at all. It's really rare in professional animation to see an exact straight line. Secondary action. Secondary action is a supporting action added onto a main action in animation. It's not to be confused with overlapping action. Instead, secondary action is there to emphasize the main action. We might have a guy knocking on a door. Having the back hand following behind the elbow is the overlapping action, but then making the hand express some kind of supporting emotion makes a secondary action. We can make it angry by making that second hand into a fist, or clutch it in to show fear. We could have a guy eating a burger, but we can emphasize that it's delicious by adding secondary actions of licking lips or shaking the person's head in disbelief. Make sure that the secondary action does not overshadow the primary action by staging it correctly. So just think about how you can show what a character is thinking or feeling based on how you add that secondary motion. Timing. The amount of frames added to an animation will influence how the viewer perceives it. The more frames you use in between the key start and end poses, the slower the object seems to be. Vice versa, it might be perceived as fast if less frames are used. When games run on 24 frames per second, each second you actually see 24 frames of animation. That's what FPS means. If it takes 1 second for an object to reach from point A to point B, you use 30 frames if the object is super fast. Unlike if it took 5 seconds to reach point A to point B, which will make the object seem slow since 5 times the amount of frames were used. When animating on 24 frames per second, if there are 24 drawings a second, you're animating on ones. If there's 1 frame for every 2 seconds, you're animating on twos, and skipping 3 is thirds, and so on. It's similar to reducing your FPS, but it takes the same amount of time to reach each key pose as you just hold a key pose 1 frame longer. Animating on twos is the most common because of efficiency, and it creates a more lively and energetic feel. But as seen in Spider-Verse or K-pop Demon Hunters, shout out Sony Animation, switching from animating on ones, twos, and threes can sell an effective aesthetic. So one interesting example that I can think of this is in Spider-Verse, when Miles is first learning to web swing, they actually animate him with less frames per second as compared to Peter Parker, who's teaching him. But then as Miles starts to learn how to web swing, they increase the amount of frames that he gets per second to show him figuring it out. So that was a creative use of ones and twos. So yeah, most animations will be on ones, 24 frames per second. As you're learning, you might animate on twos, 12 frames per second, but mixing them can create some really creative aesthetics. Exaggeration. This one's number 10. We're almost there. Animation that perfectly replicates real life tends to be dull or boring. Disney animators ultimately found the idea that exaggeration actually makes things look more convincing. Pushing key poses into more extreme positions can sell power and motion way better. The faster the animation, the easier it is to also hide extreme exaggerated deformities. So, you can have crazy stretch frames as long as they're quick. If you look up like smear frames, so go look up smear frames for your favorite show. I'm sure that you've seen some pretty funny ones. The first ones I think of are the Naruto smear frames. But animations, because you're exaggerating, you can slip some really funny frames in there, and they're actually just used to make a motion feel more realistic because you're exaggerating that motion or that blur. Yeah, so look at this first guy smashing that guy with a frying pan. That motion actually looks more realistic in the second one because you can really tell what's happening by that exaggerated pose. But in that first one, even though that might be more what a frying pan looks like, it's actually, you feel the weight less because it's less exaggerated. This is really obvious in those old-fashioned like Tom and Jerry type animations. You can really see that they're exaggerating every single pose. Solid drawing. So solid drawing refers to the idea that drawings in a 3D space must feel like they're in a 3D space through the form, shape, weight, and space they reside in. Having a good understanding of form, shadow, and perspective is important, and this skill is one developed from a lot of practice and training. This is also applied to a character's pose. You should avoid twinning, where both sides of the body are doing the exact same thing. Give the character weight in its poses and animation to show that it exists in a 3D space. So you want to think about how you aren't drawing 2D objects. Even though your final animation is going to be 2D, each of those pieces that you're drawing are a 3D object, and they should feel like they have weight and space, and they actually take up the environment that they're in. If you had a character's head rotating, it will always rotate more like a sphere than like a circle because you're imagining that it has that 3D space. And yeah, this one takes a lot of practice. You really just have to learn how each piece of a character is actually a 3D solid object and figure out how you can show that. Okay, our final principle of animation, number 12, appeal. So have characters that are interesting to look at. You want to have characters that are interesting to watch and look at. This goes into character design, which we aren't discussing in depth in this workshop, but we might discuss in a later workshop, hint hint. Your characters should be fun to look at. To make a dynamic design, use shapes to exaggerate interesting features and make interesting silhouettes. Make sure your characters, however, have less details if you plan to animate them. Intricate designs quickly become a pain to redraw over and over, so just choose those really important parts to keep. I remember watching a tutorial video about animation, and there was this phrase that the person who created the video was talking about their animation professor teaching them, which was KISS. It stood for Keep It Simple Stupid. And it was basically the idea that when you're animating, you're going to have to draw this character over and over again. So you only want to preserve those parts that are the most important to the character and exaggerate who they are the most. You don't want your character to have 5,000 belts Although it may look very cool, it's going to be such a pain to have to redraw those belts over and over again. So instead, you want to think about what would most sell that character. If having one big chunky belt tells you who they are, then keep that belt. But you want each piece of them to be important to who they are as a character in their design. And also, you want to keep it simple, stupid, so that you don't end up hating yourself after you've been drawing this one character for 3 hours. All right, finally, let's talk about some animation tools. So, what are the tools and techniques that animators use to help create their animation? Most, if not all, animators will always take references of what they plan to animate. Lots of times they'll end up filming themselves doing the motions. Then they take that reference and use it to help animate their character by basically matching key poses and motions. Now, you can technically trace directly over your referenced video, which is a known technique called rotoscoping. You might have seen rotoscoping before. Sometimes it has almost like a humorous or comedic quality in some videos that I've seen because it feels so exactly real in a way that can seem odd. So that's that second option. Great example of rotoscoping is Take On Me. That music video is amazing. It has, like, you can see each frame is drawn over a person's real life motion, and it's really cool mixed with real life. And then also, motion capture software for 3D animation directly captures and translates human movement through their funky ping pong ball suits. The problem is that that's what I was just talking about, perfectly rotoscoping human movement can create an uncanny valley effect where something looks not quite human, but almost human. Think Polar Express, which makes people feel a bit creeped out. That's why animators go back in and smooth out their rotoscopes by polishing arcs, exaggerating more to remove stiffness, ultimately being bound by a box, referring to always rotoscoping, will subconsciously keep you from experimenting as you always strive for realism. So take a look at this animation of Ariel. You can see that those motions are exaggerated, which actually feels more natural for a animated character than if you just like rotoscope directly over that animator. So there is a universal tool that animators use that actually communicates the timeline of an animation, especially if you were to work in a studio. There's a lot of information to hand around. The use of timing charts directly shows the animator how the scene will be timed and spaced. So here's some timing charts. How do you read one of these? It's kind of like a timeline flipped on its head. On the top and bottom, those notches are going to be the key poses of an animation, like the beginning and end pose of each motion. We will also circle them to show that they're the keys. Now, if you were to add a frame in between pose A and pose B, we make a notch in the middle of the timeline. C is now signaling that its pose is the midpoint of point A and B. We underline it to show that it is the extreme, which is kind of like a key pose, but of less importance. We put it in the middle, but what if the animator you pass your timing chart thinks that the line is favoring just a little bit towards pose A and draws a frame there and not in the middle? So now we have to draw these curved lines. These we add so that the animator that you're past your timing chart to knows that the distance between A, B, and C should be perfectly even. Now, if we put a notch between A and C and B, adding these curves shows that pose D is the in-between of pose A and C, and now pose E is the in-between of pose C and B. This is very confusing, but hopefully it's somewhat making sense. So now this is an evenly spaced 5-framed animation, which would look like this. So now let's take our timing chart and reorganize a few notches. Notch C is still the midpoint of A and B. D is still the midpoint of A and C, but now E is the midpoint of A and D. This is how slow out is done, where the more frames are added at the beginning, the more they show acceleration before speed up. So now the opposite here. Slow in adds frames at the end to show the deceleration at the stop. Combining slow in and slow out gets the more realistic motion of an object gaining speed and then easing back into a stop. So now, when we add, sorry, I've got a lot of notes here. Now, when we label the notches with numbers while animating on 2s, we now know which frame a drawing will be placed. Now, one thing to note, all of these animations actually take the same amount of time to complete. Adding more frames does not mean that you're increasing the runtime. It actually just displays more frames within the runtime. The time it takes to run each frame is constant. It's the poses of the drawing that influence the perceived speed. Slow in takes 3 frames to reach the midpoint. Slow out takes 11 frames to reach the midpoint, but they both reach frame 13 at the same exact time. So yeah, take a look at these animations for a second and realize that all of them are actually taking the same amount of time to complete, but their speed simply looks different because of how you're positioning those keyframes. So here's an example of that applied to character animation. The expression when slowing in decelerates into an in pose. So the slow out accelerates into the in pose. Using timing charts allows animators to plan out their drawings because it shows the spacing between each frame along with the timing of each piece. So take a look at this motion of this little bee character. Every single one of those has a slightly different feel to it, and that's because of that timing chart. So if you were an animator and you passed on a timing chart, you'd want to make sure that you got the motion that you wanted when an animator helped fill in your in-betweens. So that timing chart, it's kind of like a secret code that helps convey exactly what type of motion you want your fellow animators to complete for your character. All right, that is all for our animation workshop. So next time, let's talk about future events hosted by EGATS. We are having a Thanksgiving potluck social on Monday. Wow, that's tomorrow. Hopefully this video gets up quickly and you watch it quickly because you don't want to miss that. It's gonna be awesome. It's a free event, but you're encouraged to bring a dish or a board game. There will be Jackbox, pumpkin painting, the movie K-pop Demon Hunters, and more. You'll have to show up to find out what more. Our next Unity workshop will be Tuesday in GDC 4.302 from 6 to 8. We have Dev Nights in the Dev Nights voice chat 5 to 7. We are building a horror game, so feel free to join us. No experience needed as we have mentors and leads to help. Every new month, we post a new Game Sprouts theme. Game Sprouts are a fun challenge where you submit a work related to the released monthly theme, which could be anything from artwork, music, or game mechanics, and we tally participation for a prize pool of $100. Lastly, our next art workshop will be the 2nd of December, where we learn about character design and pixel art. Make sure that you show up because it's going to be really awesome. We can finally talk about those character design elements that we touched on today. Thank you guys for your patience to get this 4th workshop out there. We hope to see you again next time. Thanks for showing up. Bye. Have a great rest of your day.